The wind carried ash before it carried warning. Einar Solberg smelled it 3 days before anyone else in the valley noticed. That faint, bitter tang of burning grass drifting down from the high plains, thin as a rumor. He was 34 years old, a shepherd by trade, and a stonemason by inheritance. And he had learned as a boy in Norway that smoke on a dry wind meant something was already lost, somewhere, and the only question left was how far it would travel. He had come to the Nebraska plains 4 years earlier, with nothing but a crate of masonry tools, a Norwegian prayer book he could no longer read without his eyes stinging, and the kind of stubbornness that made neighbors call him careful instead of clever. His dugout sat cut into the side of a low ridge, walls of packed earth, roof of sod and timber, a home like every other home for 40 miles in any direction, except Einar had spent the entire summer doing something no one else on the ridge understood. He was lining the inside of his dugout walls with river stone, not decoration, not a fireplace surround. Every wall, floor to ceiling, packed tight with fist-sized stones hauled up from the creek bottom 2 miles away, one wagon load at a time, mortared with a clay-lime mixture. He mixed himself in the evenings after the sheep were penned. Neighbors rode past and saw him hauling stone in July heat when he should have been cutting hay, and they shook their heads. "You're building a root cellar you can live in," old Torvald Lien told him one afternoon, leaning on the fence rail, sweat darkening his collar. "Stone floors will freeze your feet by November." Einar kept stacking. "Maybe. You could put up 2 sod houses for the wagon loads you've hauled. Maybe that too." Torvald laughed, not unkindly, and rode on. That was the shape of it. All summer, men who respected Einar's hands, but doubted his judgment, watching him spend his short growing season on something none of them could name a purpose for. His neighbor Halvard Ness, younger and more direct, put it plainer one evening over coffee. "You're a shepherd, Einar, not a castle builder. What are you keeping out?" "Wolves don't come through walls." Einar only said, "Not wolves." He didn't explain further, mostly because he wasn't fully certain himself. Not yet, not in words he trusted. What he had was an old memory, half-formed, of his grandfather's stone byre back in the fjord country, a building that had stood through a hillside fire when every timber structure around it had gone to ash. He remembered the walls of that byre radiating warmth. Long after the flames passed, remembered his grandfather saying something about stone not remembering fire the way wood does. He had been 9 years old. He hadn't understood it then. He wasn't sure he understood it now. But something in him trusted the memory enough to spend a summer proving it. And above the ridge, the prairie itself was drying into tinder. The spring rains had failed. By August, the grass stood pale and brittle, waist-high in places, a sea of fuel stretching to the horizon in every direction the wind could reach. Everyone on the ridge could feel it. That low, persistent unease of a season that hadn't rained enough, of a summer that felt like it was holding its breath. By the end of August, the question hanging over the whole settlement wasn't whether fire would come, it was when. The stones came from the creek 2 miles east, where the water had spent centuries rounding them smooth. Einar chose them by hand, rejecting the porous, cracked ones that felt too light, keeping only the dense, water-worn stones that felt cold even in July sun. He didn't know the word for what he was testing, density, but his palms knew the difference, and his palms were the only instrument he trusted. The work was brutal in a way that had nothing to do with drama, and everything to do with repetition. Load the wagon. Haul it up the grade, unload by hand, stone by stone, into stacks beside the dugout entrance. Mix the mortar, clay dug from the creek bank, lime he'd burned himself in a small kiln behind the sheep pen, water carried up in a barrel. Set the stones one course at a time, working from the floor up, checking each layer with a plumb line made from a fishing weight and twine. His wife had died the winter before last, of a fever that took 3 families on the ridge that same season, and Einar had raised his daughter Astrid alone since. She was 7 now, quiet and watchful, and she spent the summer afternoons sitting on an overturned bucket near the dugout entrance, handing her father stones, one at a time, sorted by size the way he'd taught her. "Why does this one go by the door and not that one?" she asked once, holding up 2 stones that looked to her identical. Einar turned the first one over in his hand. "Feel the weight." She weighed them, one in each palm, frowning. "The same. Try again. Close your eyes." She closed her eyes. A long moment passed. "This one is heavier," she said finally, lifting her left hand slightly. "That one goes low, near the floor, where the cold sits longest. The heavy stone holds the cold the way a good coat holds the warm, and it will hold heat the same way, when we need it to." When will we need it to? Einar didn't answer that directly. He rarely did, that summer. He was building towards something he could feel more than explain, and explaining it wrong felt worse than not explaining it at all. By early September, the walls were finished. 3 courses of river stone lining every interior surface of the dugout, floor included. The stone floor itself set in a bed of sand and packed clay so it wouldn't heave with frost. The roof remained sod and timber, the traditional prairie construction, because Einar hadn't yet solved how to stone a roof without it collapsing under its own weight. That gap would matter later. For now, he simply noted it the way he noted everything that summer and moved on to the next problem. The next problem arrived with the first real test of the season, not fire, but rain. A hard 3-day storm blew through in mid-September, the kind that turned every low place on the ridge into standing water. Sod roofs across the settlement wept for days afterward, brown water tracking down interior walls, bedding soaked, a familiar and miserable ritual of prairie homesteading. Einar's dugout wept too. The roof was no different from anyone else's, but something strange happened on the walls themselves. The stone stayed dry. Not immediately dry, but within a day of the rain stopping, while his neighbor's packed earth walls stayed damp and cold for a week, sweating moisture into the air, breeding the smell of mildew that every soddy on the plains knew intimately. Einar's stone walls had already dried to the touch. He didn't understand why at first. He only noticed it, filed it away, and kept working. It was Astrid who noticed the second thing. "The floor is warm," she said one evening in late September, sitting cross-legged near the hearth after supper, palm flat against the stone, even over there. She pointed toward the far wall, 6 feet from the fire. Einar walked over and pressed his own hand to the stone. She was right. The warmth had traveled, not fiercely, but steadily, radiating outward from where the cookfire had burned all afternoon, soaking into the stone and releasing it slowly back into the room even now, an hour after the coals had been banked. He sat with that observation for a long time that night, turning it over, the way he'd turned over river stones all summer. Heat going in, heat coming back out, slower, later, gentler. He thought of his grandfather's byre again, and for the first time since he'd started the work, he let himself believe he understood, at least partly, what he was building. But understanding a principle and surviving a season were 2 different tests, and the harder one was still ahead. October brought the first real cold, and with it, the first real doubts among the neighbors began to shift into something else. Not quite respect, but curiosity. Halvard Ness stopped by on a morning when frost had silvered every blade of grass on the ridge, when smoke rose from every soddy chimney in thin gray columns, everyone burning wood or dried dung to fight the chill. He ducked into Einar's dugout, expecting the same cold, damp interior every other home on the ridge suffered through that time of year. He stopped just inside the doorway. "It's warm in here." "The fire's been out since morning," Einar said, not looking up from the harness he was mending. Halvard walked to the wall and pressed his palm against the stone, the way Astrid had. "This shouldn't be warm. The stone holds the fire's heat longer than the fire burns. Gives it back slow, through the day and night. We burn less wood than you do. Astrid and I have been measuring the wood pile. We're using perhaps 2/3 what we used last winter, in a house the same size." Halvard turned that over, visibly uncomfortable with how much sense it made. "You knew this all summer? Hauling stone in the July heat?" "I hoped it," Einar corrected. "I didn't know until the stone told me." That exchange traveled the ridge faster than Einar expected. Within a week, 3 neighbors had come by under one excuse or another, all of them really coming to press a palm against the stone walls and feel the strange, quiet warmth radiating back at them. Torvald Lean, who'd predicted frozen feet, stood in the dugout for a long moment, saying nothing, then finally admitted, "I was wrong about the floor. It's the warmest floor on the ridge." But warmth wasn't the whole answer, and Einar knew it. Warmth explained why the stone was useful. It didn't yet explain why he'd felt, all summer, a pull toward this specific material that went beyond comfort. Something older than comfort. Something closer to the memory of his grandfather's byre and the hillside fire that hadn't touched it. He wouldn't understand the full shape of that memory until the following August. The following August, when the drought that had merely threatened in the first summer returned in earnest worse and brought with it the thing every rancher and farmer on the high plains feared above blizzard, above flood, above almost anything. The second summer was drier than the first. By July, the grass that should have stood green and thigh-high across the range had browned to the color of old rope, brittle enough to shatter underfoot. Creek beds that normally ran ankle-deep had narrowed to cracked mud with a trickle down the center. Even the wind felt different, hot and dry, carrying dust instead of moisture. The kind of wind that made cattle restless and dogs pace at night for no reason anyone could name. Einar spent the spring making improvements he'd been planning since the fall. He extended the stone lining higher along the interior walls, closer to the roofline, and packed a wider apron of bare earth and stone around the dugout's exterior entrance. A cleared perimeter, stripped of grass, stone-edged, extending perhaps 15 feet out from the doorway and the small exposed section of roof where sod met sky. He hadn't fully articulated why he was doing it. It simply felt, to his mason's instinct, like an unfinished thought. If stone held heat and resisted moisture, what else might it resist? What else traveled the way heat traveled? Searching for fuel, moving from a source outward until something stopped it? Halvard, watching him clear the bare perimeter one May afternoon, finally asked the question everyone had been dancing around for a year. "What are you actually afraid of, Einar?" Einar straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. He thought about the fjord country, about his grandfather, standing in the blackened aftermath of a hillside fire, running a hand along byre walls that hadn't burned while every wooden structure around them had. He thought about the phrase his grandfather used, translated roughly from Norwegian. "Stone does not feed the fire. It only holds what the fire gives it." "Fire," Einar said simply. "Not this year, maybe, but it's coming. This grass wants to burn. Everyone can feel it." Halvard didn't argue. He'd felt it too. Everyone on the ridge had. The dry summer stretched through June and into July without relief. Lightning storms came without rain, the driest, most dangerous kind, cracking across a sky that offered nothing but static and heat. No water to accompany the fire they sparked. Twice that July, distant smoke columns rose on the horizon. Small grass fires that burned themselves out, or were beaten back by ranch hands with wet sacks and shovels before they grew large. Both times, the whole ridge held its breath. Both times, the fires stayed distant, and life resumed, tense but unbroken. The third time, in the second week of August, the wind was wrong. It began, as it usually did, as a rumor of smoke on the horizon. A thin gray smudge to the southwest that most people assumed would burn itself out against a fire break or a stretch of already grazed pasture, the way the others had. Einar noticed it at midday, working the sheep in from the north pasture, and something about the color of that smoke made him stop and watch longer than he normally would. By late afternoon, the smudge had become a wall. The wind that had been merely dry all summer turned, sometime after 3 o'clock, into something with real force behind it. A hot, steady gale out of the southwest that bent the dried grass flat and carried the smell of burning across 5 miles in what felt like minutes. Einar had seen grass fires before. He had never seen one moving like this. A dark orange line low on the horizon, spreading not as a front but as a wave, jumping ahead of itself in gusts, throwing embers far beyond the flame line itself. He didn't waste time being afraid. He'd spent 2 years, without fully admitting it to himself, preparing for exactly this hour. Astrid, the sheep now, into the stone pen by the creek bend. She didn't argue. She'd grown up fast in the 2 years since her mother died, fast in the particular way that prairie children grew up, and she ran for the flock without needing a second instruction. Together, they moved the sheep down toward the creek, where the water and the bare rocky bank offered the only real safety a moving fire couldn't easily cross. It took 20 minutes of hard, breathless work, dogs snapping at heels, sheep bawling and scattering and being turned again, smoke thickening overhead until the afternoon sun went the color of a blood orange. With the flock secured at the creek, Einar ran back toward the dugout. Not to save it, he told himself, but to be certain there was nothing left inside worth losing, and to see, with his own eyes, whether 2 years of hauling riverstone had been worth anything at all. The fire crested the ridge to the southwest a little after 5 o'clock. What followed was the fastest 30 minutes of Einar Solberg's life, and the longest. The grass around the dugout, everywhere except Einar's cleared, stone-edged perimeter, went up almost instantly. Flame racing across dried prairie grass at a speed that made running feel useless. A wall of orange and black smoke rolling over the ridge, with a sound like a distant train, low and continuous and utterly without mercy. Embers rode ahead of the main flame front on the hot wind, landing on sod roofs across the settlement, on wooden fence rails, on hay stacked near barns. Torvald Liensadi caught first, not the grass fire reaching it directly, but an ember landing in the dry sod roof, smoldering, catching, spreading across the roofline, before anyone even knew to fight it. Halvard's barn went next, the hay inside feeding a fire that consumed the whole structure in under 15 minutes. All along the ridge, that same story repeated. Dry sod, dry timber, dry hay, all of it fuel, all of it waiting for a single ember to arrive on the wind. Einar's cleared perimeter did what he'd hoped, though he hadn't been certain until that exact hour that it would. The grass fire itself, The racing wall of flame that consumed everything around it reached the bare stone-edged earth surrounding his dugout and found nothing to burn. Fire needs fuel to travel, and for 15 feet in every direction, Einar had removed the fuel. The flame front didn't leap that gap. It rolled around it, hunting for grass on either side, and continued on toward the creek bottom. But the embers were a different danger entirely, and this was where the real test began. Burning debris rode the wind onto Einar's sod roof, exactly as it had onto every other roof on the ridge. Small embers, some still glowing, landing in the dry grass thatch woven through the sod, the same vulnerable material every dugout and soddy on the plains shared. Einar watched, heart hammering, as 3 separate embers caught in his roof within the space of a few minutes, small orange points beginning to smolder in the dry grass. This was the gap he'd noted the year before and never fully solved. The roof. Still sod and timber, still as vulnerable as anyone's. He didn't panic. He'd thought about this exact possibility more than once, lying awake on windy nights, and he moved now with the calm of a man executing a plan rather than improvising one. He'd kept 2 barrels of creek water beside the entrance all summer, refilled daily, exactly for a night like this. He soaked a wool blanket, climbed onto the low roofline, and smothered each smoldering patch by hand, working fast, choking on smoke, feeling the heat of the main fire front still radiating from the burning grass beyond his cleared perimeter. 3 embers. 3 small fires stopped before they became one large one. It was close, closer than he wanted to admit even to himself. But the roof held, because the roof only had to survive isolated embers, landing in isolated patches, not a wall of flame racing across it the way it raced across the open prairie. The stone perimeter had denied the fire its highway. The wet blanket and the water barrels had denied it the last few footholds it found anyway. Inside the dugout, where Astrid had wanted to shelter, and Einar had refused to let her, the temperature never rose past uncomfortable. The stone walls, the same walls that had held and released the winter's cookfire heat so gently, now did something closer to the opposite. They absorbed the ferocious heat radiating from the fire outside, drawing it into their mass rather than letting it concentrate against anything flammable, releasing what little passed through slowly enough that nothing inside ever came close to igniting. Where a wooden or packed earth interior might have scorched, dried further, become more vulnerable with each passing minute near open flame, the stone simply absorbed and held, patient and inert, exactly the way it had absorbed and held the warmth of 100 ordinary cookfires the winter before. The fire passed over the ridge in under an hour, moving fast on that hot wind, leaving behind a landscape Einar barely recognized. Blackened grass stretched to every horizon. Smoke hung low over everything, acrid and thick, and scattered across that burned ridge. The wreckage told its own story without needing anyone to narrate it. Torvald Leein's soddy was a smoking ruin, roof entirely collapsed, the family standing in stunned silence beside what remained. Halvard's barn was gone completely, along with the winter's hay. 2 other homes on the ridge had burned in whole or in part. Livestock that hadn't reached water or bare ground in time had scattered in panic, and it would be days before anyone fully accounted for the losses. Einar's dugout stood exactly as it had that morning. Scorched at the roofline where the embers had briefly caught, the grass around it burned black in every direction, right up to the stone-edged perimeter he'd cleared. But standing, whole, unburned, the only structure on that stretch of ridge that hadn't fed the fire anything to consume. Neighbors came the next morning, walking across ash-black ground still warm underfoot in places. Smoke still rising in thin threads from smoldering fence posts and stubble. They came the way people come to something they need to see with their own eyes before they'll believe it. And they stood in front of Einar's dugout in a loose, silent half-circle, looking at the one home on the ridge the fire hadn't taken. Torvald Lein was the first to speak, his own home a blackened frame behind him, his voice quiet in a way Einar had never heard from him before. 2 years, Torvald said. 2 years I told you that stone was foolishness, that you were wasting your summers. You weren't wrong to doubt it, Einar said. I wasn't certain myself, most of that first summer. What made you certain enough to keep hauling stone then, when the rest of us thought you were building a tomb? Einar considered the question honestly before answering. I wasn't certain. I trusted something my grandfather showed me once, a long time ago, in a place far from here. A stone building that survived a fire that took everything around it. I didn't understand why, not fully, not until the winter, when Astrid put her hand on the floor and told me it was warm. Then I understood a piece of it. I didn't understand the rest until yesterday. He walked to the nearest wall and rested his palm against the stone, still faintly warm from the fire's passing. the way it had been faintly warm all winter from the cookfire. Stone doesn't burn, he said. It doesn't feed a fire the way wood does, or dry grass, or hay. It takes heat in, the way it took in the warmth of our fire all winter, and it lets that heat go slowly, instead of catching and spreading it the way everything else on this ridge does. The bare ground around the walls did the same thing in a different way. It gave the fire nothing to travel across. The fire didn't spare my home. It simply had nothing here that it could take. Halvard, standing at the edge of the group, looked at the stone walls for a long moment, then at his own ruined barn in the distance. You spent 2 summers building something none of us understood, for a danger none of us were certain would come. I wasn't building against certainty, Einar said. I was building against the chance. That's the only kind of building that matters out here. You don't wait for the fire to teach you. By then, it's finished teaching. That autumn, 4 families on the ridge began hauling river stone up from the creek bottom, learning from Einar's mistakes as much as his successes, where the stone should sit thickest, how the mortar needed to cure before winter, why the exterior perimeter mattered as much as the interior walls. It was slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that wouldn't show its value for a year, sometimes longer, and more than one of them grumbled through the August heat, the same way Einar's neighbors had grumbled at him. But they kept hauling stone anyway, because they had stood on a blackened ridge and seen, with their own eyes, the one house the fire could not take. Astrid grew up in that dugout, and grew old enough eventually to explain the principle herself, plainly, to her own children, that stone remembers heat differently than wood remembers it, holding what it's given and giving it back slow, refusing to burn no matter how hungry the fire outside becomes. She never called it complicated. She'd learned it as a girl, sorting stones by weight with her eyes closed, feeling the difference in her own 2 hands, long before she had words for what that difference meant. And on windy August afternoons, when smoke sometimes still rose somewhere on a distant horizon, she would rest her palm against the stone wall of the home her father built, the way he had shown her, and wait to feel the quiet, patient warmth that had once, on the worst evening of her childhood, meant the difference between everything and nothing at all.